Have you ever had a moment where nothing technically went wrong, no shouting, no confession, no explosion, but something inside you quietly understood that your position had shifted, that the rules you thought you were living under were no longer the rules being applied to you, and that whatever came next wouldn't be about truth or intention but about what could be documented, justified, and calmly enforced, long after your chance to explain had already passed? Have you ever noticed how adulthood teaches you to trust calm more than clarity, to believe that if nothing is loud then nothing is wrong, and how dangerous that belief becomes when your life depends on noticing small things? That Tuesday night felt exactly like the kind of night you don't remember later, the kind built on routine and exhaustion and the comfort of repetition. And I told myself that was proof everything was fine. That after years of marriage you learn to stop interrogating silence because questioning peace feels immature, paranoid, unnecessary. So I focused on ordinary details instead, shoes lined up by the door, my jacket hanging where it always did, the faint hum of the house settling after a long day, and I remember drying my hands longer than I needed to at the sink, not because they were wet but because something in me hesitated, a pause so small I almost missed it. The kind you explain away instantly because adulthood trains you to smooth over discomfort before it turns into conflict, to swallow unease and label it stress, fatigue, imagination. And that's the real trap no one warns you about, that long before betrayal happens, you're already practicing how not to see it, how to reinterpret odd looks, delayed responses, checked phones, tiny shifts in tone as nothing worth naming. Because naming things has consequences and staying calm feels safer than being right. And yet even as I moved through that familiar evening, I felt a thin crack forming beneath the normalcy. A sense that this night was slightly off script in a way I couldn't explain without sounding dramatic. So I didn't explain it at all. I just kept going, convincing myself that maturity meant letting things slide, that love meant trust, that silence meant stability. Not realizing that silence can also be a staging ground, a place where decisions are made without you, and that sometimes the most dangerous moment in a relationship isn't when someone yells or storms out, but when everything stays quiet right up until a phone buzzes, and someone decides who gets believed. Have you ever noticed how one sentence can quietly flip your entire life from familiar to dangerous? How a normal night can turn hostile not because of what's proven, but because of what's suddenly believed? The phone buzzed and the room shifted before I even understood why. Because the sound wasn't loud but it was decisive, the kind of interruption that doesn't ask permission. And when she froze mid-scroll and looked up at Susan instead of me, I felt it before I heard it. That thin pressure in the air that tells you something irreversible is loading. She said my name like it wasn't mine anymore, like it belonged to a version of me she'd already finished inventing. And when she pointed and said, "It's him," everything paused for half a second too long. Long enough for me to realize there's a difference between being accused and being reframed. Because accusation still leaves room for defense but reframing replaces you entirely. And in that gap my denial didn't land as truth or lies. It landed as inconvenience. Something that didn't fit the shape of the story forming in real time. I said it wasn't true, calmly. Because adults are trained to think calm equals credibility. But here calm became suspicious and silence became dangerous. And I could feel Susan choosing something familiar over something accurate. Not because she hated me, but because fear prefers the story that already has a villain ready. There was no investigation, no questions that mattered, just language tightening around me, words like unsafe, unstable, concern, terms that sound reasonable until they're pointed at you, and I watched belief move faster than evidence, watched posture change before facts did, watched a marriage collapse not with screaming but with certainty, the kind that doesn't need proof to feel complete. By the time I tried again to explain, I could tell it was too late, because the room had already decided who I was allowed to be, and whatever version of me had paid the bills, fixed the house, kept the peace, no longer fit the need of the moment. When Susan told me to leave, it didn't feel like anger. It felt procedural, like the next logical step after a conclusion had already been reached. And I understood then that what was happening wasn't about truth at all. It was about containment, about removing the variable that made the story uncomfortable. Walking out into the cold didn't feel dramatic. It felt administrative, like I'd been quietly removed from my own life. And sitting in the car afterward, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I realized something that scared me more than the accusation itself. Whatever happened next wouldn't be to find out what really happened. It would be to record what they decided happened. And once your name enters that kind of narrative, it doesn't exit cleanly, it follows you. Have you ever realized too late that the very traits you built your life around are the ones being used against you? That steadiness can be reframed as guilt and patience can start to look like permission. Once I was out of the house, sitting alone in the car with the engine off and the rain ticking against the windshield. It hit me that nothing I'd done wrong mattered nearly as much as everything I'd done right. Because loyalty only works when it's mutual. And the moment it isn't, it stops being a virtue and starts becoming evidence. I replayed the last 17 years in fragments, the nights I stayed quiet to keep the peace. The times I absorbed blame because it was easier than watching things escalate. The way I'd learned to smooth situations before they became problems. And I could see the pattern clearly now. How every act of restraint had trained them to expect my compliance. How my role had slowly shifted from partner to stabilizer. Someone whose job was to make discomfort disappear. That's the trap no one warns you about as an adult. When you become the person who always handles things, you also become the person who gets handled when something needs to be hidden. I thought about how quickly Susan had accepted the story that made her feel safest. Not because she was cruel, but because believing me would have meant questioning everything else. And loyalty to reality is much harder than loyalty to a narrative that keeps your world intact. My phone buzzed again, this time not with accusations but with silence. Hours passing without explanation. And that absence said more than shouting ever could. Because silence isn't neutral when it's chosen by the people who used to explain themselves to you. I realized then that if I kept reaching out, kept trying to repair what I hadn't broken, I would only be confirming the version of me they'd already settled on, the one who needed forgiveness, who needed permission, who needed to prove he was safe. And that was the moment loyalty finally snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity, because staying calm had already been misread. Staying present had already been weaponized. And staying invested would only deepen the record forming around me. Adults like to believe endurance is strength. That if you just hold on long enough things correct themselves. But endurance without boundaries isn't strength. It's erasure. And I could feel myself shrinking every time I imagined walking back in and apologizing for something I didn't do just to restore order. The fear wasn't of losing the marriage anymore. It was of losing myself inside a version of events that required my silence to survive. And that's when I understood the real cost of loyalty. It asks you to decide whether peace is worth being misrepresented. Sitting there, alone, with my name already circulating in conversations I wasn't part of, I knew the next phase wouldn't be emotional. It would be procedural. Because once belief hardens, it doesn't look for reconciliation. It looks for confirmation. And whatever came next wouldn't test my innocence. It would test whether I kept cooperating with a story that needed me smaller than I actually was.
Have you ever noticed how adulthood teaches you to fear raised voices, but never prepares you for how dangerous a calm, official tone can be, especially when it's directed at you instead of around you? Because that's the moment you realize the story has left the room you're standing in and entered a place you're no longer invited into. And that's exactly how it happened for me. Not with a confrontation or a threat, but with a call that sounded routine enough to feel safe until it wasn't. A voice that introduced itself slowly, professionally, using my name as if it already belonged to a file instead of a relationship. And in that instant I understood something most adults only learn when it's too late. That the moment an institution reaches out, the purpose is never to ask what happened but to confirm what's already been decided. Because questions aren't neutral when they arrive with a timestamp, a case number, and an expectation of cooperation. And as I listened, saying less than I felt was required and more than I should have, I could feel the quiet shift from private conflict to public record, from disagreement to documentation, where every pause I took sounded like hesitation and every attempt at clarity felt like justification. And the most unsettling part wasn't fear but familiarity. The way the process assumed I would comply because adults like me always do. We show up, we answer calmly, We trust that being reasonable will protect us, not realizing that reasonableness is often interpreted as manageability. And manageability is what systems look for when they decide how much pressure they can apply without resistance. And I remember thinking how strange it was that no one asked how I was, only whether I understood. Because understanding is compliance adjacent. And once you understand the process, you're expected to move through it without friction. And that's when it became clear that whatever this was, it wasn't about resolution. It was about alignment. About seeing whether I would stay within the lines drawn by people who weren't present when the night began but were now defining how it would be remembered. And as the call ended with polite finality, the kind that leaves no room for follow-up questions, I sat there realizing that adulthood doesn't punish chaos first. It tests stillness. It watches to see if you'll remain calm enough to be processed, cooperative enough to be routed correctly, quiet enough to not disrupt the narrative forming around you. And that's when the fear sharpened. Not because something loud had happened, but because nothing had. Because silence had been interpreted as capacity, and capacity invites responsibility, and responsibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites record. And once you're recorded, you don't get to decide which version of yourself survives. Because the call didn't accuse me, it didn't threaten me, it simply confirmed that from this point forward, anything I said or didn't say would exist outside of me, moving through channels I couldn't see. And the most adult part of the realization wasn't panic but recognition, the understanding that this is how lives tilt without spectacle, how reputations bend quietly under procedural weight. And as I stood up to continue a night that technically hadn't ended, I knew something irreversible had already begun. Because when a story becomes recorded, it stops asking who you are and starts deciding how you'll be handled. And that's the moment you realize the narrative no longer belongs to the people involved. It belongs to the system that noticed. Have you ever noticed how the moments that change everything don't arrive with conflict or urgency, but with a quiet assumption that you'll simply fall in line? Because what happened next wasn't another accusation or another call. It was something far easier to miss, a small procedural detail that slid into place so smoothly it almost felt polite. An email that didn't ask if I was available but listed a time as if it had already been agreed upon. Language that didn't demand cooperation but implied it. And what unsettled me wasn't the request itself but the posture behind it. The way the system moved forward without checking whether I was moving with it. Because silence had already been interpreted as stability and calm as consent. And I could feel the shift happening beneath the surface where no one needed to pressure me anymore, because pressure only exists when resistance is expected. And here, resistance wasn't anticipated at all. It was as if my role had quietly updated without notification, from someone under review to someone included in the process, and that inclusion felt more dangerous than exclusion ever had. Because participation creates responsibility, and responsibility creates visibility. And visibility, once established, never fully disappears. And I realized how easily adults get trapped here. Not through fear but through professionalism. Through the instinct to remain reasonable, to not be difficult, to prove reliability when reliability is no longer neutral. Because the system doesn't need you to agree with it, it only needs you to continue engaging on its terms. And every small compliance teaches it how to proceed without resistance, how to move the timeline forward, how to normalize your presence inside a structure you didn't consent to entering. And what frightened me wasn't the detail itself but how natural it felt to overlook it. How adulthood trains you to treat these moments as logistics instead of leverage, as scheduling instead of signaling. And I caught myself almost responding automatically, almost confirming availability just to keep things smooth, just to avoid creating friction that might look suspicious. And that's when I understood the real test wasn't about truth or cooperation, it was about awareness, about whether I would notice that something had already been decided without me and choose whether to step into it anyway. Because once you accept the frame, even silently, the system doesn't need to escalate, it simply continues. And the scariest part wasn't that anyone was watching closely, it was that they no longer needed to, because momentum had replaced scrutiny. And I could feel the future narrowing, not through force but through assumption, through a path being cleared that only required me to keep walking. And I knew then that the most dangerous details are the ones that feel reasonable enough to ignore, because they're the ones that decide where you end up before you realize a choice was ever being made. Pressure didn't arrive as a demand or a threat, it arrived as a subtle change in texture, the kind that's easy to miss if you're not already paying attention. Because nothing was explicitly asked of me at first, nothing was denied either. It was just that replies took longer than they used to. Conversations that once resolved themselves started ending with phrases like "we'll circle back" or "that's still under review." And I noticed how often my name appeared in messages that didn't actually require my input, as if my presence itself was being logged rather than my contribution. And that's when it became clear that pressure doesn't always push forward. Sometimes it waits for you to fill the silence yourself, to volunteer clarification, to smooth over uncertainty before anyone has to ask for it. And I felt that familiar adult instinct rise up, the urge to be reasonable, to be helpful, to make things easier for everyone involved, even though no one had said there was a problem yet. And that's the part that matters, because the pressure wasn't about forcing action, it was about inviting it, quietly, politely, with enough ambiguity that any response would feel like my idea, and every non-response would feel like a choice I'd have to justify later. And I started noticing how often questions were framed as check-ins instead of inquiries, how responsibility drifted without ever being formally assigned, how urgency was expressed through tone rather than timelines, and how the system seemed perfectly content to let me sit with that discomfort, because discomfort, unlike resistance, still produces movement. And what struck me most was how nothing here felt hostile. It felt orderly, calm, almost considerate, which made it harder to name as pressure at all, because adults are taught that pressure looks loud, obvious, aggressive, not like this, not like a calendar invite with no agenda, or a follow-up email that says, just making sure you saw this, without specifying what this actually requires. And I realized that the system wasn't trying to corner me, it was testing something quieter. It was testing whether I would keep compensating for the lack of clarity, whether I would keep offering alignment in the absence of direction, whether I would continue translating silence into obligation the way I always had. And that's when it became clear that pressure doesn't need to escalate when compliance is still on the table. It only needs to create friction, just enough to see who absorbs it and who resists it. And I could feel that friction settling in, not as fear, but as a low-level tension that followed me through the day, into conversations, into decisions that suddenly felt heavier than they should have, because even without being told to do anything, I could sense that something was being measured. Not my actions yet, but my posture, my responsiveness, my willingness to stay aligned without being reassured. And the unsettling part wasn't that pressure had arrived, it was that it arrived so quietly that responding to it felt optional, even though I knew, instinctively, that opting out would not be. Have you ever noticed how adulthood teaches you that slowing down feels safer than saying no? That hesitation sounds more mature than refusal, especially when the consequences aren't immediate but quietly cumulative. And how that instinct to delay, to soften, to stay agreeable just a little longer starts to feel less like cooperation and more like erosion once you realize the system you're inside is no longer asking but watching. That's where I found myself then, not pushing back outright, not staging any defiance, just beginning to move half a step slower than expected, answering without volunteering, acknowledging without advancing, because something in me finally understood that the danger wasn't confrontation but automatic alignment, and the smallest resistance available was restraint, a subtle refusal to keep smoothing over gaps that weren't mine to close. It didn't look like rebellion from the outside. Emails still got replies, meetings still got attended, I still sounded reasonable, but something shifted in how much effort I supplied, how quickly I filled silence, how eagerly I translated ambiguity into action. And that's when the texture of the pressure changed, not louder or harsher, just more attentive, like a weight redistributing itself once it realizes the surface it rested on is no longer perfectly level. Requests began arriving framed as reminders, timelines softened into just checking in, language stayed polite while expectations remained intact, and I realized compliance had never been about agreement, it had been about momentum. About keeping things moving so no one had to look too closely at how dependent that movement was on my quiet participation. By simply slowing my contribution, by not compensating, not anticipating, not preemptively fixing, I wasn't stopping anything, I was revealing something. And the moment that became visible, everything felt subtly recalibrated, as if the system was no longer assuming my alignment but waiting to see whether the delay was temporary or structural. Because once alignment stops being automatic, it doesn't trigger confrontation, it triggers attention, and whatever happens next doesn't need refusal to begin, it only needs that attention to stay where it is. Pressure didn't arrive as a demand or a threat, it arrived as a subtle change in texture, the kind that's easy to miss if you're not already paying attention, because nothing was explicitly asked of me at first, nothing was denied either. It was just that replies took longer than they used to. Conversations that once resolved themselves started ending with phrases like "we'll circle back" or "that's still under review." And I noticed how often my name appeared in messages that didn't actually require my input, as if my presence itself was being logged rather than my contribution. And that's when it became clear that pressure doesn't always push forward. Sometimes it waits for you to fill the silence yourself, to volunteer clarification, to smooth over uncertainty before anyone has to ask for it. And I felt that familiar adult instinct rise up, the urge to be reasonable, to be helpful, to make things easier for everyone involved, even though no one had said there was a problem yet. And that's the part that matters, because the pressure wasn't about forcing action, it was about inviting it, quietly, politely, with enough ambiguity that any response would feel like my idea, and every non-response would feel like a choice I'd have to justify later. And I started noticing how often questions were framed as check-ins instead of inquiries, how responsibility drifted without ever being formally assigned, how urgency was expressed through tone rather than timelines, and how the system seemed perfectly content to let me sit with that discomfort, because discomfort, unlike resistance, still produces movement. And what struck me most was how nothing here felt hostile. It felt orderly, calm, almost considerate, which made it harder to name as pressure at all, because adults are taught that pressure looks loud, obvious, aggressive, not like this, not like a calendar invite with no agenda, or a follow-up email that says, just making sure you saw this, without specifying what this actually requires. And I realized that the system wasn't trying to corner me, it was testing something quieter. It was testing whether I would keep compensating for the lack of clarity, whether I would keep offering alignment in the absence of direction, whether I would continue translating silence into obligation the way I always had. And that's when it became clear that pressure doesn't need to escalate when compliance is still on the table. It only needs to create friction, just enough to see who absorbs it and who resists it. And I could feel that friction settling in, not as fear, but as a low-level tension that followed me through the day, into conversations, into decisions that suddenly felt heavier than they should have, because even without being told to do anything, I could sense that something was being measured. Not my actions yet, but my posture, my responsiveness, my willingness to stay aligned without being reassured. And the unsettling part wasn't that pressure had arrived, it was that it arrived so quietly that responding to it felt optional, even though I knew, instinctively, that opting out would not be. Have you ever noticed how adulthood teaches you that slowing down feels safer than saying no? That hesitation sounds more mature than refusal, especially when the consequences aren't immediate but quietly cumulative. And how that instinct to delay, to soften, to stay agreeable just a little longer starts to feel less like cooperation and more like erosion once you realize the system you're inside is no longer asking but watching. That's where I found myself then, not pushing back outright, not staging any defiance, just beginning to move half a step slower than expected, answering without volunteering, acknowledging without advancing, because something in me finally understood that the danger wasn't confrontation but automatic alignment, and the smallest resistance available was restraint, a subtle refusal to keep smoothing over gaps that weren't mine to close. It didn't look like rebellion from the outside. Emails still got replies, meetings still got attended, I still sounded reasonable, but something shifted in how much effort I supplied, how quickly I filled silence, how eagerly I translated ambiguity into action. And that's when the texture of the pressure changed, not louder or harsher, just more attentive, like a weight redistributing itself once it realizes the surface it rested on is no longer perfectly level. Requests began arriving framed as reminders, timelines softened into just checking in, language stayed polite while expectations remained intact, and I realized compliance had never been about agreement, it had been about momentum. About keeping things moving so no one had to look too closely at how dependent that movement was on my quiet participation. By simply slowing my contribution, by not compensating, not anticipating, not preemptively fixing, I wasn't stopping anything, I was revealing something. And the moment that became visible, everything felt subtly recalibrated, as if the system was no longer assuming my alignment but waiting to see whether the delay was temporary or structural. Because once alignment stops being automatic, it doesn't trigger confrontation, it triggers attention, and whatever happens next doesn't need refusal to begin, it only needs that attention to stay where it is. It happened the way these things always do when a system decides you've been quiet for long enough, not with urgency, not with accusation, but with a message so carefully neutral it almost felt considerate. An email that arrived mid-morning on a weekday with a subject line that could have meant anything and therefore meant everything. Something like following up or just checking in. The kind of phrase designed to sound optional while quietly asserting continuity. And I remember staring at it longer than I should have because what struck me wasn't what it said but that it existed at all. Because until that moment silence had been tolerated. even rewarded. And this was the first signal that my absence had finally registered as a variable instead of background noise. The language inside was polite to the point of being antiseptic: no blame, no emotion, no reference to conflict, just a brief recap of our previous interaction, a sentence about ensuring alignment moving forward, and the softest possible request for a response at your earliest convenience, which is a phrase adults learn too late is never about convenience, it's about timing. And reading it, I felt that subtle internal shift where you realize the story is no longer waiting on you to explain yourself, it's waiting on you to participate, because replying would confirm availability, clarify posture, and expand the surface area they now had permission to work with, and not replying would do something else entirely, something I couldn't yet name but could feel pressing against the edges of the moment. What unsettled me most was how familiar the tone was. How it mirrored dozens of professional exchanges I'd had over the years where nothing bad ever happened, which is exactly why it worked. Because the system didn't need escalation when normalization would do, didn't need to demand when it could assume, and I could almost feel the quiet recalibration happening on the other side. My silence no longer read as neutrality, it read as delay, and delay is something systems resolve one way or another. I noticed how the email referenced no outcome, offered no deadline, created no visible threat, and yet somehow managed to tighten the frame, because now there was a thread, and threads create history, and history invites follow-up, and follow-up eventually becomes record whether you consent to it or not. And sitting there with my phone face down on the table, I realized this was the first true test of the posture I'd been holding since everything started, not whether I was innocent, not whether I was right, but whether I would step forward simply because I was asked nicely. Adulthood trains you to respond to polite outreach reflexively, to fill gaps before they become awkward, to smooth edges before anyone has to name them, and that instinct was there in me too, humming under the surface, urging me to type something brief and reasonable just to keep things moving. But I didn't, not yet, because for the first time I understood that movement itself was the currency, that the reach wasn't about resolution but about restoring momentum, and once momentum was back in their hands, the rest would follow naturally, efficiently, without malice. I let the email sit unread for a while, then read, then unanswered, feeling the weight of that choice settle in my chest, because I knew this was the moment where the system stopped waiting and started deciding what my silence meant, and whatever came next wouldn't arrive as conflict or confrontation, it would arrive as process, already justified by the fact that they had reached out and I hadn't. Have you ever noticed how the most important shifts in adulthood don't arrive with confrontation or explanation, but with a subtle wrongness you can't quite point to at first? The kind that shows up as a delay that didn't used to exist, a tone that feels flatter than it should, a door that still opens but no longer feels like it's opening for you. Because that's how this phase began for me, not with a warning, not with a threat, but with the quiet realization that something fundamental had already moved while no one bothered to tell me it had. And once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Responses that used to arrive quickly now came packaged in neutral language and timed gaps. Decisions that once looped me in casually were suddenly already underway by the time I heard about them. References to ongoing considerations replaced direct answers, and no one said I was excluded, which was the point, because exclusion would have been visible, defensible, debatable, while this was something cleaner, something that let everyone pretend nothing had changed while everything essential had. And the unsettling part wasn't that I'd been pushed out, it was that I'd been quietly reclassified, shifted from participant to variable, from contributor to condition, as if my presence was now accounted for in advance rather than invited in real time. And I found myself replaying earlier moments, the email phrasing, the neutral outreach, the way clarification had expanded instead of resolved, and realizing those weren't attempts to reconnect, they were alignment checks, soft confirmations that I would still behave predictably even as my role narrowed. And the more I complied calmly, the more the system adjusted around me without resistance, because systems don't need to announce change when compliance makes transition frictionless. They just move the furniture while you're still sitting in the room and trust you'll adjust your posture rather than ask why the layout feels different. And that's when it clicked that nothing dramatic was coming. No confrontation, no declaration, no clean break, just a slow normalization of absence dressed up as continuity, where my name still appeared in threads but my influence didn't, where I was informed rather than consulted, where timing shifted just enough that my input always arrived too late to matter but early enough to feel acknowledged. And the danger in that isn't anger or loss, it's disorientation, because adults are conditioned to interpret politeness as safety and inclusion as security. So you keep telling yourself nothing is wrong while your leverage quietly drains away. and I could feel the old instinct rise up again, the urge to compensate, to reinsert myself by being helpful, responsive, agreeable. But this time something stopped me. Not courage, not defiance, just recognition. The understanding that whatever had changed wasn't asking for my reaction, it was counting on it, and reacting would only confirm the new shape I'd been placed into. So I didn't push, I didn't ask what was happening, I didn't demand clarity. I just watched the pattern finish forming, because by the time you can name a change like this out loud, it's already been operational for a while, and the only real question left isn't why it happened. It's whether you notice it before you adapt yourself out of relevance, because once change goes unannounced, the next thing that follows is never explanation, it's consequence.
The first time it didn't work. There was no alarm attached to the moment. No raised voice or sudden consequence. Just a small, unmistakable hitch in the machinery where something I did, something calm, reasonable, and familiar, failed to produce the outcome it always had before. And I remember noticing it not because of what was said, but because of what didn't happen afterward. The expected follow-up that never arrived. The confirmation that used to close the loop and quietly reassure me that I was still legible to the system. Because for a long time my reliability had been the currency that made everything else negotiable. And when that currency stopped converting, I felt it immediately in my body before I could articulate it in words. I responded the way I always had, carefully, clearly, without friction, offering context without defensiveness, assuming that clarity would still function as a bridge. And instead it landed like excess information, acknowledged but unused, filed rather than engaged with. And the silence that followed wasn't neutral the way earlier silences had been. It had weight, the kind that suggests a decision has already been made and your input is now archival rather than influential. And that's when I understood that the system wasn't waiting for alignment anymore. It was testing something else entirely, whether my patterns would hold even when the reward disappeared. Because consistency without reinforcement reveals more than compliance ever does. And for the first time I could feel the asymmetry clearly. The way my efforts still cost me attention and care while theirs cost nothing at all. The way responsiveness had quietly turned into exposure. And what unsettled me wasn't that I'd made a mistake. It was that I hadn't. Not by any reasonable adult metric. And yet the outcome had shifted anyway. As if the rules I'd been playing by were still valid but no longer applied to me specifically. And there's a particular kind of disorientation that comes from realizing you're behaving correctly inside a framework that has already moved on without updating you. Because your instincts keep reaching for tools that no longer work. And each attempt drains a little more leverage, a little more confidence, until you start questioning not the system but yourself. Wondering if you missed a signal, if you misread the tone, if you should have done more or less or nothing at all. And that's the trap. Because systems don't need you to fail to justify adjustment. They only need your responses to become predictable enough that deviation becomes visible. And the moment my usual approach stopped producing results, I could feel the old reflex flare again, the urge to correct, to follow up, to restore equilibrium by filling the gap with effort. But this time the gap held firm. And in that pause something crystallized. The realization that the system wasn't broken and it wasn't hostile. It was simply no longer calibrated to reward the behavior it had already extracted full value from. And the danger wasn't that my approach didn't work once. It was that it might never work again. Because when a system stops responding to your best version of yourself, it's not asking for improvement. It's signaling that your role has already been revised. And the only thing more revealing than that first failure is what happens next. When you decide whether to keep offering a key that no longer turns, or whether you finally stop trying to open a door that has already been closed quietly, politely, and without explanation. There's a moment that doesn't announce itself. No sound cue or visible failure. Just the quiet understanding that the thing you're holding no longer responds to effort the way it used to. And I remember standing there with the key already in my hand. Not frozen exactly. Just aware that turning it again would teach me nothing new. Because the resistance wasn't mechanical. It was contextual. The kind that doesn't grind or snap but simply refuses to acknowledge force. And what struck me wasn't frustration so much as recognition. The same recognition you get when you knock on a door and hear movement inside but no one answers. Not because they can't hear you, but because they've decided not to. And in that pause I realized how many times before I'd mistaken persistence for participation. How often I'd kept applying pressure to prove goodwill, to restore equilibrium, to show alignment, and how every previous turn of that key had worked not because the lock welcomed it but because the system surrounding it still benefited from my trying, still translated effort into access, still treated engagement as proof of legitimacy. But now the silence on the other side wasn't accidental, it was informational, and I could feel the familiar reflex rise. Adjust angle, try again, explain, follow up, only this time the reflex didn't complete itself, because something in me recognized the pattern before the action, understood that the test was no longer about whether the door would open but whether I would keep volunteering motion in a space that no longer converted it into response. And standing there I felt the shift that doesn't look like resistance from the outside, just restraint. The kind that feels almost passive until you realize how much discipline it takes not to reach forward when you've been trained to, not to smooth silence when you've been rewarded for filling it, not to keep proving access when the terms have quietly changed. And I understood then that stopping wasn't surrender, it was calibration, an acknowledgement that the system had already moved on and that continuing to test the lock would only generate more evidence of willingness without leverage, more data without agency. And what surprised me most was the absence of drama in that decision. No anger, no finality, just the quiet acceptance that whatever relationship had existed between effort and outcome was no longer symmetrical, that the door didn't need to reject me explicitly because it had already learned I would stand there and keep trying, and choosing not to turn the key again wasn't about giving up, it was about preserving the one variable I still controlled, which was whether my behavior continued to supply a process that no longer required my consent. And as I stepped back I realized how unfamiliar that felt, not because it was wrong, but because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't responding to a system's silence by offering more of myself into it. It didn't happen immediately, which is how I knew it mattered, because systems don't react to absence the way people do, they wait to see if it's real, if the pattern holds. If what looks like restraint is actually just delay. And for a while nothing changed on the surface. The same neutral tone, the same open-ended phrasing, the same expectation that I would eventually step back into motion and restore the familiar rhythm. And I remember noticing how quiet my own days had become without the constant low-grade effort of anticipating, clarifying, smoothing, and how that quiet wasn't relief exactly, but space. The kind that lets you feel time again instead of just responding to it. And then, subtly, the first signal arrived, not framed as a reaction but as a check, a small recalibration disguised as courtesy, a message that acknowledged the gap without naming it, as if to confirm that the line was still live, that the channel still existed. And what struck me was how carefully it avoided urgency, how it left room for me to resume without forcing the issue. Because even now the system preferred voluntary compliance to explicit demand, and I could feel the old reflex flicker, reply promptly, reassure continuity, re-establish presence, but I didn't act on it, not out of defiance, just because I recognized the test for what it was, not about content, not about resolution, but about whether my silence had weight or was merely a pause waiting to be filled. And when I didn't rush to answer, when I let the message sit exactly as it was, something shifted beneath the politeness, not visible yet, but perceptible in the timing, in the follow-up that arrived sooner than the last one would have, in the slightly narrower framing of the question, the way options were presented as assumptions instead of invitations. And that's when I understood that the system had noticed the missing input and was beginning to compensate for it, not by escalating, but by tightening, by reducing ambiguity on its own terms, because absence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is something systems are designed to eliminate, and I felt a strange calm in that realization, not satisfaction, just clarity, because for the first time since this began, the movement wasn't coming from me, I wasn't advancing the process or cushioning its edges, I was simply present enough to observe how it adjusted when the usual supply of responsiveness stopped flowing. And that observation carried a different kind of risk, quieter but more honest, because now whatever happened next wouldn't be something I'd helped shape through overparticipation. It would be a response to the boundary I'd drawn without announcing it. And as I watched the tone grow more precise, the intervals shorten, the language settle into something firmer without becoming overt, I realized that silence, when sustained, doesn't just register as absence, it registers as friction, and friction prompts recalculation, and the system was recalculating now, not angrily, not dramatically, just methodically, adjusting its approach to account for the fact that one of its most reliable inputs had stopped behaving predictably, and standing in that space, with no action required of me yet, I understood that this was the moment the story had been quietly waiting for, not the moment of conflict, but the moment of recognition, when the system finally acknowledged, in its own restrained way, that something it depended on was no longer automatically available. The rules didn't arrive as a confrontation or a warning. They arrived as clarity, and that's what made them dangerous, because clarity sounds helpful, cooperative, almost generous. And I remember reading through them with that initial sense of relief you get when uncertainty finally settles into shape, until I realized that this wasn't guidance at all. It was definition. And clarity wasn't guidance, it was definition. The kind that doesn't ask how you feel about it, only whether you now understand where you stand. And what changed wasn't the substance of the expectations but the way they were fixed in place. Timelines named, language tightened, options reduced to paths that all led in the same direction, and everything was framed calmly, professionally, as if this structure had always existed and was only now being articulated for my benefit, with phrases like, going forward, and, for consistency, quietly erasing the past without reopening it. And there was no accusation embedded in the wording, no emotion to react to, just a steady narrowing that removed the need for interpretation altogether. Because interpretation had been the last space where judgment lived, and I could feel that space closing without anyone acknowledging it, like doors being shut softly in adjacent rooms while you're still standing in the hallway, noticing not the sound but the absence of movement. And the unsettling part was how reasonable each rule felt on its own, how defensible, how easy it would be to explain to someone else why this made sense. Because none of it was excessive or harsh or obviously unfair. It was simply complete, and completeness leaves very little room for goodwill to operate. And as I read, I became aware that nothing in these rules required my initiative anymore. Nothing depended on me anticipating needs or smoothing edges or filling gaps, because the gaps had been closed. And that was the moment it became clear that this wasn't about making things easier for me. It was about making outcomes easier to predict without me, and there was a quiet finality in that realization. Because when systems move toward clarity, it's rarely for comfort. It's for control. Not aggressive control, but efficient control, the kind that doesn't need to check in or follow up or wonder how something will be received. And I noticed how the tone never shifted, how there was no suggestion that this was temporary or responsive, no language of adjustment or experimentation. Just a settled sense of, this is how it works now. And for the first time I didn't feel the old instinct to demonstrate fluency, to show that I could adapt quickly and operate cleanly within the new structure. Because that instinct depended on the idea that understanding still mattered, that performance could still soften edges or earn flexibility. And standing there with everything laid out so neatly, I understood that the purpose of clarity isn't to be mastered, it's to be enforced. And once rules reach that state, knowing them doesn't protect you, it positions you. And the difference is subtle but absolute, because one invites participation and the other establishes boundaries that don't move just because you respect them. And as I reached the end of the document, aware that nothing in it was overtly threatening and nothing in it could be argued against without sounding unreasonable, I felt the last illusion fall away, the illusion that there was still something to interpret. Something to negotiate, something to repair through effort or understanding, because the rules weren't asking for anything new, they were simply clarifying where everything already stood. And when that happens, there's nothing left to explain, only something waiting to happen next. The first time clarity was used against me, it wasn't dramatic or loud or even particularly unfair on its face. It was small, procedural, and almost forgettable if you weren't paying attention. Which is exactly why it worked. Because clarity doesn't announce when it becomes a tool, it just gets applied. And I remember realizing something had shifted not because of what happened, but because of how cleanly it was justified. A request denied not with hostility but with reference. A protection that didn't activate because a condition hadn't technically been met. A timing window that closed because the rule now existed in writing instead of practice. And there was no room to argue without sounding confused, because the clarity was correct, precise, and already agreed upon. And that was the moment it became obvious that clarity isn't neutral once it's operational. It's directional. It moves outcomes while pretending to stand still. And what unsettled me wasn't the loss itself but how little anyone needed to explain it. Because the explanation had already been given earlier, embedded in language that sounded helpful at the time. And now all anyone had to do was point back to it, calmly, almost kindly, as if reminding me of something I'd forgotten rather than enforcing something new. And I could feel the ground change under that realization. Because this wasn't escalation, it was execution. The rules weren't being debated or tested or even interpreted anymore. They were simply being used. And the effect was immediate but quiet, like a door that locks automatically once it senses it's been closed. No alarm, no warning, just a new fact you can't undo. And I noticed how my instinct to explain flickered and died halfway through forming. Because explanation assumes discretion still exists, assumes there's someone on the other side weighing context. But clarity removes the need for that. It replaces judgment with alignment. And once alignment is required, context becomes noise. And the denial didn't feel personal enough to protest and didn't feel unjust enough to resist. Which is the most efficient position a system can take. Because it leaves you with nothing solid to push against. Just a clean surface that reflects your own compliance back at you. And standing there, watching a small outcome slip out of reach for reasons that were technically sound, I understood something that hadn't been clear before. That clarity doesn't cause harm by being wrong. It causes harm by being final. Because once a rule has been clarified and then applied, it stops being a guideline and becomes a filter. And filters don't care how close you were or how cooperative you've been. They only care whether you pass through. And I could feel how this first use changed the shape of everything that followed. Because now there was precedent. Not emotional precedent, but procedural precedent. The kind that doesn't need to be discussed to be reused. And I became aware, not with panic but with a steady sinking recognition, that this wouldn't be the last time clarity was used. It was just the first time I felt it land. And nothing about it invited reaction. There was no anger to respond to, no tone to challenge, no intent to question. Just an outcome that fit perfectly inside the structure that had been laid out earlier. And that was when it became clear that the danger of clarity isn't in misunderstanding it. It's in surviving the moment you realize it works. Because once you've seen it applied, you know exactly what it's capable of. And you also know it doesn't need to hurry, argue, or raise its voice ever again. It started working every time, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing needed to anymore. Because after the first clean use of clarity the system no longer hesitated or adjusted or searched for tone. It simply repeated itself. The same outcome arriving with the same wording, the same references, the same quiet finality. And what unsettled me wasn't the refusal itself but how effortless it had become, how little attention it required. Like a mechanism that had already learned the exact shape of resistance it would never encounter again. And I noticed that no one checked in the way they once had. No follow-ups disguised as concern. No gentle probing questions. Just results appearing where requests used to go. And somewhere in that repetition I felt the last illusion dissolve. The belief that variability still existed. That effort or timing or phrasing could introduce a different ending. Because now each interaction resolved itself before it fully began. And I felt that knowledge settle into my body in small, practical ways, pausing before writing anything, recognizing which doors no longer invited knocking, adjusting my movements not out of fear but out of certainty. And the most unsettling part was how calm it all felt. Not cold, not cruel, just stable, like realizing a landscape won't change no matter how often you cross it. And days continued normally around this new shape. Meetings elsewhere. Conversations that no longer involved me in the same way. Not through rejection but through quiet rerouting. As if my presence had been accounted for and filed under something finished. And I understood then that this was the end of friction. Not resolution. The point where nothing pushes back because nothing needs to. Where outcomes arrive without explanation because explanation is no longer part of the process. And I felt time move forward evenly. Without tension. Without hope of reversal. Just continuity. And that was when it became clear that the story hadn't ended in confrontation or victory or collapse. It had ended in reliability. In knowing exactly how something would respond every time and choosing to stop interacting with it beyond what was required. Because predictability removes drama by replacing it with environment. Something you don't argue with or persuade. Something you simply move within. And I could feel myself doing exactly that. Adapting quietly. Conserving energy. Redirecting attention to places where movement still mattered. And nothing about that felt like surrender. It felt like recognition. The kind that doesn't announce itself. That doesn't need witnesses. Just a private understanding that this loop had finished closing. And whatever came next would not be shaped by this system at all. Not because it failed or was defeated, but because it had become complete. Functioning exactly as designed. Every time. And I had finally stopped standing in its way long enough to see where life continued once the pattern held.